was a sight for my soul.
Welcome to the Inspired Evolution, and it is an absolute treat to be here today. We have with us Dr. Patrick Gentempo. Patrick, how are you, brother?
I'm doing fantastic. How about you?
Yeah, man, I'm doing great. An absolute pleasure, and doing better for having you here today.
Thank you.
All righty. So for those tuning into Patrick for the first time, get ready, sit down, grab a cuppa, or if you're driving, hopefully you're already sitting down. Don't go grab that cuppa. Stay focused on the road. So Patrick is a serial entrepreneur who has founded and led multiple million-dollar companies, right? Early in his career, he was practicing as a chiro. He developed diagnostic technologies for which he received multiple patents with decades of experience, having founded and co-founded over 15 businesses, man, ranging from all things like diagnostics all the way through to something like filmmaking, right? So he has a specialized skill, which is what we're going to talk about today, in the practical application of philosophy. Now, he applies that to business. He's been published by Forbes, has testified in front of Congress on the use of technology in healthcare. He's given testimony to the White House Commission on complementary and alternative medicines, and he's received numerous business and healthcare awards. Dude, there is so many places we could go with this particular podcast. But the key place I want to start, and I just want to dive in, put on the rubber gloves and just go there with you. Practical versus theoretical philosophy and living a philosophical approach to life. For those tuning in, this was totally and wholly inspired by Patrick does this epic TED talk. Please go check it out. I'll put it in the show notes for you guys to go check it out. And it was one of those times where I listened to a TED talk and it was just like every few sentences was like, yes, 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 yes. And I was just getting more and more into that. I was like, yes, this is speaking to my soul. And the crux in there was, there's theoretical philosophies, but then there's practical philosophies. And I should probably shut up and let you do some talking on that.
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks for having me. Secondly, thank you for your smile. It's inspiring and contagious. So that makes this all fun. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So philosophy. So and that's why people I'm introduced very often as a philosopher, and I am, but I'm a practical philosopher, not an academic philosopher, and they are very different things. So do I have some knowledge of kind of the history and systems of philosophy, and do I understand Kant and Plato and Aristotle and so on? Yeah, but not like a PhD philosopher would have in an academic setting. I visited those realms because I find it intellectually stimulating, but what I'm really interested in is how philosophy can become a tool for success in life. And that's the practical application of philosophy. And it's a very different thing, and it's a very different experience. So I start out by saying typically that everybody has a philosophy. You who are listening to this right now, you have a philosophy. So you have no choice about that fact. The only choice you have, to kind of paraphrase Ayn Rand, the philosopher, is whether or not you defined it in a conscious, rational, and disciplined way, or let it accumulate like a junk heap in your subconscious. And most people, are walking around that way. And I'm not trying to degrade people in general, as far as saying, that if they haven't done work in the practical application of philosophy, that there's some kind of an ethical judgment around that. There's not. What I am saying, though, is that many people are finding themselves in positions of being self-defeating, exasperation, cyclic cycles of destruction, where you start to make progress and then they kind of self-immolate or self-destruct, and they can't understand why, and they many times will ascribe these challenges to something that might be more mystical in their own mind, like luck, things of that nature, or you're being born under a bad sign or whatever it might be. And but the reality is that I think it's something much more tangible than that, and something that that is fixable. So what got me started on this path, and I think this one philosophical premise sent me on my way of practicality, or the applied practicality of philosophy, was from Ayn Rand. And I think many people probably know who Ayn Rand is. She wrote the book Atlas Shrugged, which she's probably best known for, The Fountainhead, but she's got a lot of nonfiction work and a lot of lectures and other things that I studied. and her intellectual heir was Nathaniel Branden, who was my mentor. So that, but I sought him out because of who he was and my work in this realm. But what Rand said is that when you have contradictions in your basic philosophical premises, the only possible result is destruction, and the amount of destruction is relative to the level of that contradiction. So I that struck me immediately as truth when I heard it the first time. And I started, and the practicality of it was glaringly obvious to me, because I said, so that means if I can identify contradictions in my life and solve them, I'm going to evolve. And it turned out to be true. So every time I started to utilize philosophy as a tool and identify where I might have had contradictions in my values and my metaphysical premises and my the branch of philosophy known as epistemology, my theory of knowledge. How do I know things? As I can start to examine that and I can see conflict or contradiction in those realms, if I can resolve those contradictions, then I can evolve to the next level. And so I started doing that on a personal level effectively. And then with my entrepreneurial efforts, I started to apply that to business and found that in business, it was staggering what the application of philosophy could do there.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things I want to drop in around is, can you unpack a little bit like the contradictions and the destruction piece there? Because I think it's yeah, I can tell how much you've shared this before, because it's really tight the way you've described it. But I think there's a whole rabbit hole there. Can you describe potentially what some of the contradictions look like, and then potentially how that leads to destruction?
Sure. So for example, let me just say this: nobody is contradiction free.
Damn it!
Yeah, exactly.
This episode.
I mean, that would be the perfect human, and there's maybe in religious circles they can ascribe that to specific historical characters, but in general, us mere mortals, there's no such thing as anybody who's, again, this is my lens that I look through. There's no such thing as anybody that's 100% contradiction free.
So can I just take a quick punch at that in there? There's a book that I've got here. It's called The Difficulty of Being Good. And it actually is dedicated to the Mahabharata, which is an old Indian sacred text. And it's talks about all the avatars in the story. And these are stories of the gods. And the gods, the difficulty of being good is that each person has a boon. Each avatar has a boon. But with that boon comes a certain curse. Right? Because if you're all focused towards one direction, then there's going to be certain things that are left wanting, let's just call it that. And so I hear what you're saying in terms of even in the design of the gods, and the interplay between each other, it's this beautiful story where everybody's trying to do good, but with a different intention. And it's there's those certain bits. So we're not all perfect yet.
And what I love the fact that you raise that in the context of this particular conversation, because I think being contradiction free 100%, you would be boring, or or as the old saying might go, once you're ripe, you start to rot. So it's good to say that there's always something to aspire to. There's always some new thing to learn, some new thing to experience, and we can keep going to higher levels of that. And the idea of saying, okay, well, that's over would be sort of I think a sad experience. So and why that's important is that we shouldn't self-deprecate because we have contradictions. It's like saying, okay, no, I am somebody now who wants to live consciously, mindfully, in a way that can allow me to observe myself, to clarify certain things about me. And as a consequence, I can learn and grow and become a better version of me as I identify and resolve contradictions. And on a systemic level with, let's say a business where you have multiple people at work in a business, to me, the whole idea of a business in giving it a soul is giving it its philosophy, which means knowing its values, knowing its purpose, understanding its vision, getting those things clarified, not as a weekend exercise that gets thrown in the drawer when you're done, but literally becomes the heartbeat and the soul of the business. And when you are operating in alignment with that, with those values, when the business is and everybody in it is, then magic happens, extraordinary things happen. And when there's contradictions between the way the business operates versus what its values are, that's when you have destruction and business starts to fail. So it is, but and there's always things to work out, always higher level evolution. So just maybe some examples. I've done a lot of work because I'm a chiropractor, and I spent a lot of years running, fairly large scale businesses within the chiropractic profession, where we had diagnostic technologies and training and business training and so on. So some of the examples that can come from that I think are obvious to anybody is I would have chiropractors who would say they have a practice that I'd say, what are your values? What's the purpose of the practice? We want to do lifetime family wellness care. Tell me your philosophical premises. What's your view of reality? Well, the body is self-healing and self-regulating in its nature. The nervous system is the master system and control of that body. So those are two what we'd call axioms, philosophically, metaphysical views that are pretty much self-evident. Mm-hmm. And so it would stand the reason that if we, and now we're going to that branch I call epistemology, theory of knowledge, which would be deduction. So we say, if the body is self-healing and self-regulating, which it is, and if the nervous system is the master system and controller of that body, which it is, then it would stand the reason deductively that if you interfere with nervous system function, you must necessarily interfere with the ability for the body to heal and regulate. So if that's the position you hold, and you say, okay, so now given that that's my view of reality philosophically, then what's the purpose of this practice? What would it value? And then you start to say, well, it would value being able to assess the nervous system, to find interference, to adjust these things. In chiropractic, we talk about this thing called subluxation, which is literally a distortion in the patterns of the spine that interfere with the function of the nervous system, and therefore there's less expression of life and less ability to heal and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So what do we want to do? We want to identify those subluxations and we want to remove them. And then by doing so, the person can heal, regulate, and have more life expression. So that's a view. That's one philosophical view. And a lot of people might disagree with it, but let's say that that's the view that a particular chiropractor has. Now you can match this to any business. They have premises about a view of reality. Therefore, it translates into the values that the business will have. And then that leads to their purpose, which are the actions that they take on those values and premises. And what happens, many people start with purpose, but purpose emerges from that third branch of philosophy, which is ethics. You have to start before that and lead to that purpose. So my point here, though, is that this particular chiropractor, I'm using as an example, did all that thinking, developed all that philosophy, came out with their purpose, which was a vitalistic thing in nature to address subluxation, because the other version of chiropractic is back and neck pain, meaning all we do is look to manipulate particular painful areas of the spine for the purposes of, I use the term ameliorate symptoms, reduce symptoms.
Symptom relief.
Yeah, symptom relief. And that's fine. And I'm not, and if that's your philosophical view and you built to that, and that's the purpose of the practice, I'm not morally judging it one way or the other. But this chiropractor who had the version I spoke about first comes to me, and I'm at a conference, I just got done speaking, and they're like, I'm frustrated, my practice is stuck, it doesn't grow, I can't get past a certain point, and I don't understand why. I understand everything you just lectured on, and it's the way that I see it, and the way that I feel about it. And then he said, well, I'm kind of busy, hand me a card and maybe we can follow up and have a conversation. And the person hands me a card and it says XYZ Back and Neck Pain Center. And now I looked at the card and I looked at them and I said, wait a minute, you're calling your practice Back and Neck Pain Center? And they were like, yeah. And I said, do you see how that's a complete contradiction to your entire philosophy you just told me? The way that you go to market with your brand is in contradiction to your values and your purpose in the practice. That's why you're stuck. Get these two things aligned and you will evolve to the next level of the practice. And then you'll start to see a breakthrough happen, et cetera, which is exactly what happens. And I've literally helped thousands of chiropractors move through that type of a process, as well as other businesses. So to give you, an example, that's just one example of a glaring contradiction where somebody is behaving in their life in contradiction to what their values and beliefs are.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. And that, pardon me, that probably ties into some of you wrote a book called Your Brand is Your Stand, or Your Stand is Your Brand. I got it right.
Your stand is your brand.
Yeah, exactly. I got it right the second time around. Pardon me. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes too, for those that want to check it out. And is that what I'm hearing in there as well, which is basically what you're standing for make that everything that is, integrity through the way out. And I find it really remarkable. I feel like with the age that we live in, with the digital age as well, I think, oftentimes, I think there was a different time way back when, potentially, when we would be able to buy into a product without really understanding the values and the ethics of the founder or the CEO. But I think with the transparency that the internet has now afforded us, we're going down this path where it's like Elon Musk could create, he created a flamethrower. Now, if someone else created a flamethrower, I'd be like, what is going on here? Like, I don't know if that's safe. But he creates a flamethrower and I'm like, that's cool. Why? Because Tesla's cool. Why is that? Because creating a vertical trucking company to Mars is cool. So I feel like, in this day and age, we're buying into the philosophies and the values of the leaders that are there potentially, so that we can actually follow into whatever that then they, subsequently go and create, because we understand the person behind it. And potentially that has come from, I'm just skeptical here, so pardon me if this is incorrect, but I believe it's got to do with, probably having had corrupt companies in the past, where now with the transparency the internet affords us, it's like, well, I would like to connect and understand what is going through in terms of that alignment with this company all the way from the top down. I find it quite remarkable. Tell us a little bit about, your stand, because also, like, you could stand for so many different things. I find that as being one of the biggest challenges in the inspired evolution. I'm passionate about clean waterways. I'm passionate about reforestation. I'm passionate about people's mental health. But it's like, how do you find your stand, and make that your brand? Yeah.
So first thing relative to that is that I believe that a premise, a philosophical premise that many people and businesses erroneously adopt, is that there's they find a contradiction between the moral and the practical. And so basically, if you are saying, well, this is the moral thing to do, but from a business perspective, it's impractical. So if you find that you have a contradiction between the moral and the practical, for example, saying, well, we understand our care about the environment, but deforestation, yes, morally we agree with it, but it's not practical for us to be able to run our business and have that as a consideration for the way our business needs to operate. Now the person sitting in that position would say, well, then you have a contradiction between the moral and the practical. And I'll explain where the implications of that in a moment. Or somebody who basically, let's say that you're a restaurant owner, or you're a chef owner of a restaurant, and you have a strong position about corporate, farmed animals, and you see the horrific implications of of cows and pigs, that are raised in this sort of confined corporate way, mass produced, et cetera. And the impact for, let's talk, the animals is one thing. And then of course, the impact on the environment, all these things have trickle down effects. Now, it might not mean that you're a vegetarian necessarily, because you might say, hey, local farmers who do grass-fed, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not trying to make an argument for, vegetarianism versus, meat eaters, et cetera. But what I am saying is that you might say that, but you'd say, geez, but my restaurant, I have to buy the supply of meat from those types of places and serve it. And you might think that, morally, I agree that this is a bad thing, but practically this is the way for my restaurant to function. When you have a contradiction between the moral and the practical, basically you have two choices. You can either be practical, but immoral, or you can be moral, but impractical. Which one of those would you like to choose? Obviously, the answer is neither. I mean, you're basically saying you can be a liar or a sucker. Which would you prefer? And so none of those are an appropriate state of affairs. So when you're taking a stand, what you're saying is, I understand what my values are. And that's a whole exercise in itself, to clarify your values and make sure you don't have contradictions in those. And, that's a process that's very, very important for a human being as an individual, and for every single business that's out there. But now, once you have those values, you can't start to think in terms of, well, it's, I forget the value, I'm going to violate it because this is a very practical thing to do. Another way to sort of say this, and this is whenever I've had when like the toughest times in businesses, whenever I've had businesses fail, and yes, I've started a lot of businesses, they don't all work, and I've done extremely well in many businesses and built them to scale and been able to exit them, and I've also had failures where I've lost millions of dollars of my own money in the business. That's a part of the game. My friend Rick Sapio calls it tuition. But the bottom line is I can say pretty clearly upon reflection that the times when things went bad for me is when I took opportunity over values. So one of my premises, that I live by and stay very consciously aware of is never take opportunities over values. I don't care how good an opportunity it is. If it is conflicting with your values, it's not a good opportunity for you. It will never be sustainable. It will never be something that will work out spiritually or financially.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's sorry to interrupt, but it's like it's not actually poisonous, but it's poisonous for you, right? Because
right. It's amoral until it has a reference point.
Yeah. Please. Yeah.
So having said that, an example I can give of this is, and this is a restaurant I write a lot about in my book, because I write about brand purity in one of the chapters. I talk about philosophy, its branches, how to create values, all the things we're talking about. But then I taught that probably one of my favorite chapters is called Finding Your Miles Davis. And what this is about is saying, okay, what's the purest form of you? Really digging deep, because what I believe is that there's this, you call it a soul, call it a pure form. There's a lot of noise around what words you use, but just say that there's a pure, unadulterated version of you, right? And I don't believe, in philosophy, they talk about, are you born innately with certain characteristics, or are you tabula rasa, which would be the blank slate? And I used to think in terms of tabula rasa, but I'm too old now to think that way anymore. I know that and I've got kids. So I believe that there is there's an innate identity called you. And what happens through our lives is that we have things that happen, things we learn from our mothers, fathers, teachers, preachers, things that have happened to us, bad things that we've done. And this starts to create energetic fields of distortion between what's inside of you. And then as you start to express from there, it gets distorted through these experiences. And then what actually comes out into the world is something that's a distorted representation of who you are. So I think a really good exercise is to try to go back and figure out what is that pure state of me, and understand who that person is by identity, and identity as a whole. I'm writing a whole book on that now. It's a very
great topic. Yeah.
And then secondly, how can I identify and then perfectly express that and not allow it to get distorted out into the world? And so I call that finding your Miles Davis, because what was Miles Davis known for? Whatever was in his soul was what came out of that trumpet. It was completely, he was the purest musician that expressed himself completely. So I write in the Finding Miles Davis chapter, I talk about a restaurant called 11 Madison Park. And for the foodies out there who understand Michelin stars, and I'm a foodie and I collect wine and all that kind of stuff. So when a Michelin starred restaurant is an extraordinary thing. So there's 3 stars in the Michelin system. 1 star is an amazing restaurant. Very few restaurants get a Michelin star. 2 stars, now you're in like rarefied status there. And then there's just a small amount of 3-star restaurants, in the whole world. I think there's roughly 100 or less. So it is rarefied. And New York City, 20,000 eating establishments. I think they have 7 Michelin 3-star restaurants or so. Wow. And one of them, it was called 11 Madison Park. Now 11 Madison Park was a Michelin 2-star restaurant for a lot of years. And the whole Finding Your Miles Davis story comes from their journey to finally getting their 3rd Michelin star. So I don't want to take up the whole podcast talking about that. But what I will say, this is an interesting thing, because there's the second step, because they got their 3rd Michelin star and they did it through finding their Miles Davis. And I lay out how that happened.
Right.
Great story. The last chapter of the book is called Creative Destruction. And what it's all about is saying, okay, now that you've figured out how to build this life and build this whole business, let's talk about how to burn it all down and start over again. And why that's important, it's the phoenix. You have to be willing to dive into the flames so something more beautiful can emerge. If you stay stuck, entropy takes over. The second law of thermodynamics. You start to see disorganization, disassociation, disintegration, degrades over time slowly. And what was interesting about 11 Madison Park is that they got their third Michelin star. Then a few years later, what happened? When they not only had their Michelin 3-star restaurant, they got voted the #1 restaurant in the entire world.
Whoa.
#1. So they were the best of the Michelin 3 stars. What did the chef owner decide to do when they got that? Shut the whole thing down for 4 months, gutted it to the core, and reinvented the whole thing again. That's creative destruction. Now, there's a reason why I'm telling the story, as you'll see in a second, because to me, it was mind-blowing. Something just happened relative to this. So this was, and to give you just, and I think this is an inspiring example, he took all the metal in the kitchen, pots, pans, everything that was metal, the stoves, had it all cut down, melted, and then turned it into a step. So when you step into the restaurant, you're stepping over the past and into the future. And when he was interviewed about this, the guy said, why, if you not only are Michelin 3-star, you're the #1 restaurant in the world, you get voted for I think 2017 or 18, what it was. You could double your prices. You'll have a waiting list for a year, and you can ride that for 10 years without having to do a damn thing.
Yeah.
And when I saw this interview, I saw the freest man in the world being unattached. Because think about when you're trying to cling on now to the #1 spot, he's attached. And he just said, basically his own philosophy is, okay, we did that. Now it's time for something new. And I just saw the freest human being in the world who created the best success that he could possibly do. And he was unattached to it and now said, let's burn it all down and let the phoenix rise. So they reopened, and I had gone to the restaurant since they had reopened. One of the documentaries I made was a wine documentary, and I interviewed their sommelier. And so then I went into the restaurant, my wife and I, and we had this fantastic meal experience there. Now, what do I find out? He closes down the restaurant again, and guess what he does? He reopens it as a vegan restaurant. Now, I am astounded, impressed. And in his interview, why do you take the #1 restaurant in the world? You get your Michelin 3 stars, your #1 restaurant in the world, you shut it down, then you open up something which was even better, spectacular. And now you take that and you shut it down. And he said, basically looking at what's going on with the environment and the impact that meat eating is having on the environment, he said, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I'm now going to make, vegan as beautiful and sexy like nobody's ever seen it before. See how his values. Now, if I were a practical person, I'd be looking at him, and let's say I'm an investor in that restaurant and I'm a shareholder, I'd be maybe grabbing him by the throat saying, hey, dude, I put a bunch of money into this business. I understand your positions, but put that aside. You could be, you see what I'm saying?
Totally.
This guy, his values are his values. He recognizes contradictions. He resolves those contradictions and continues to thrive by taking a stand every time he recognizes it. And I will guarantee you, without knowing, because this is a very recent event, that restaurant is going to be waiting list, explosive, financially successful. Because somebody like that takes a stand, everybody's showing up. I'll give you one more example about your stand as your brand. Because here's the thing, is that middle of the road doesn't work, especially today. Unfortunately, we're in an extraordinarily polarized world. And people, not taking stands end up sort of irrelevant. Businesses end up irrelevant. And I'm not telling you what the stand of the business would be, but I will say that when you're doing it for effect, meaning you're virtue signaling, but you don't really believe it, that's not going to work. That's a contradiction. So, but I could tell you for example, there's back in New Jersey, I just heard a story a few days ago. So there's a guy who owns a coffee house. It happens to be a really good coffee house. He came here from another country. He's an immigrant, living the American dream in essence, built this business 7 days a week, worked real hard, et cetera. Well, a couple of weeks ago, he decided he's done with masking. Now, and I'm not here to advocate one way or the other. This is not a political statement. I'm just giving you a story of a stand.
But this person's,
and people might disagree with the stand, and that's the whole point.
Mm.
He decides, I'm done with this. He says, I'm not wearing a mask anymore. My employees aren't wearing a mask anymore. Now, depending on where you live, I'm in Utah, nobody's wearing it. You don't have to here. But in New Jersey, they still had the laws there, but he decided that he's taking a stand. He's had enough. Health department shows up. You have to wear your mask. We'll shut you down. We'll do this. Go ahead, shut me down. Arrest me. I'm done. I'm taking a stand. So in New Jersey, I happen to know that there was a gym that did that. They got a lot of publicity, national news. They rallied a lot of support. It actually backfired on them to try to shut them down, et cetera. So the officials decided to get a little clever. They said, all right, you know what? We don't want to actually make this guy a martyr, because it's our cause. But we're going to, they sent in somebody with a very popular social media following, et cetera, who went in there, was appalled that they weren't wearing masks, and then blasted out all over the social media about this particular coffee shop. You shouldn't go there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So they tried to take him down just through social pressure. Next morning, he wakes up to open up the coffee shop. He's got a line 3 blocks long. People are around the corner. A guy walks up and puts a $50 bill on the counter and says, I don't even drink coffee. Just give me $50 worth of anything. I just want to support you. Thank you for taking the stand that you're taking. So what's my point? My point isn't whether you should wear a mask or not, because people doing the other stand also attract larger crowds. It is, but it's the fact of taking a stand on your values, having conviction that will, not possibly, it will alienate people. It's a necessary aspect of it. But also people know who you are. They know your brand now because of the stand that you've taken, and you're going to attract to you those enthusiastic evangelists that come into your life, that come into your business because of the stand that you're willing to take. So I want to be really clear. I'm not saying, hey, just go pick a stand because you think it might be popular. I'm talking about you have to find your values, figure out what you stand for in your life. And when you're willing to take that stand, you're going to find that it's going to attract to you things and resources and business that otherwise were never coming to you before.
I love that, Patrick. Thank you so much for the examples, brother. So how do we go about finding that in your experience? How do we connect to our values? How do we connect to, because what I'm hearing is just double down on the integrity behind everything you're showing up for. Right? Build your identity around your integrity, allow what you're creating to inform that, enforce that. That's your stand, right? But how, for those that are tuning in, it's like, okay, I'm inspired, but how do I really come home to finding out what my true values are, my true purpose is, and how do we unpack that?
Thank you for using the word double down, or the phrase double down. And I'll explain, because this is directly related to what you just asked. Friend of mine, entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, 5-6 years ago, is in a very compromised financial position, and smart enough to say, I need some advice. I need some guidance.
I need help. Yep.
Yeah, I need help. And he was willing to reach out, and he reached out to me. And I'll never forget, because we were looking on a Zoom call just like this, and it was probably Skype back then. But he said, he's explaining what's going on. He's really in a bad position, and he said, I've got this opportunity in Dallas. He lived in Utah. He said, but in Dallas, where they could do this and this, and I can do this, and I don't know that I agree with this, what service that they're offering and the way that they're billing for it and so on. He said, but I can come in there and I can impact that business through resources that I have as far as audience, and this is what they can offer me, and I can make this kind of money. And I looked at him and I just said, I know you're in a compromised position, but now you're looking for opportunity, and you're taking opportunity over values. Something we spoke about earlier. I said, if you're asking me for advice or guidance here, here's what I'm going to tell you: double down on purpose. You're in a tough position. You're in a compromised position. It's awkward. You're not meeting your obligations, and now you're almost, you feel like you gotta go out there and hunt and kill whatever you can, whether you like it or not, and I'm saying that's going to be a mistake. Double down on purpose. And he reminds me now, because At this point, all his debts paid off. His personal income is well over $2 million a year. And he said, I had a wise friend tell me some years ago to double down on purpose, and I did. He said, if I actually did that deal in Dallas, I shudder to think what would have happened if I did that. So thank you for that advice. So what's my point? And my point isn't that I'm so smart. It's just that it is important to know your values. So that's why this question is so important. How do you find your values? So there's multiple values exercises. I have one in my book. You can go, if you just search them, core value exercises, you'll see different ways people do it. But in essence, the way that and incidentally, this is the first thing I do for any business that I start, or I've come in to help friends who have businesses when they want to get something going. And the first thing I do is I do this sort of intensive immersion process, bring in the key stakeholders and say, let's figure out what our values are. And incidentally, every single time I do that, they always have a set of values they start with. And I've done this dozens of times. Never once has that set of values survived the process.
With the shiny objects pack. Come on, man.
Yes. What it told me is these values are all bullshit, right? They sound good. And I said, you sound like beauty pageant, contestants. So it sounds good, you're putting a smile, but it's fake. It's not, this is, so let's really get into what your values are. So the long answer to your question is, a fast way to do this is that you can normally find, and again, you can search this on net, but get a sheet of, values, right? And there might be, 50 to 100 different values on a sheet, and just start out saying, okay, go through the sheet and circle the ones that you believe express your personal values the most. And usually you're going to have at least 20 people, and of course, honesty, integrity, et cetera, that stuff all, traditionally matters and should matter for good reason to most people. But then there's these other values that could be a little bit more different, interesting, that help define you, that help differentiate you. And you can get in and figure out what those are. Like a company I'm just working with right now, it's not their number one core value, but it's their number two core value is beauty. And I'm not talking about, they're not a company in aesthetics or in makeup or anything like that. I'm talking about, this is a company in personal development that provides services to people to help them transform. But beauty is a core value for them. And the sense of beauty is different than, like I said, just, superficial aesthetic beauty, but it sort of makes you go, that's interesting. Why? Because they see beauty in transformation, right? And a chiropractor I worked with once, who I was beating over the head because he was just stuck. He was so mechanical in the way that he was trying to identify the values. What are you here for? Well, health and wellness, and, because I want to pull out a value and say, what becomes your catalyzing statement? What's that short statement that catalyzes people, your employees, and the people that you serve? They understood that it's different than a statement of purpose. It's in the catalyzing statement. And this person said, and Rick Sappi is the guy who came up with that. There's a TED talk he did, or TEDx talk he did on that, if you want to get more on that. And he said, and Rick and I, had businesses together, and he's a phenomenal entrepreneur. So anyway, what this guy finally came to realize is that, because he wanted a family private, why is it important to have families come in, to take care of families together, et cetera? And he had kind of window dressing around it. But then suddenly he identified beauty as a value. And how? Because I said, I'm not getting you. I'm not finding your Miles Davis, and there's a wall there. And I said, what's that on the table? I said, my journal. Your personal journal? Yeah, give it to me. And I pick up his journal. He gave it to me. And I'm going through and I'm looking, and he's writing, it's all like art and beauty. And so none of this, because he said, in business, I have to have a different frame of reference mindset. And I'm like, no, these are your values. They have to be brought into your business, because you provide the service. Anyway, what he finally landed on for a catalyzing statement, because he could say, you're in an elevator with him. Oh, what do you do for a living? I'm a family chiropractor. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Now he came up with this statement, which literally, once he finally said it, he started crying. And I got goosebumps. I said, okay, now I know we got it. And his statement is, when I asked, what do you do? His response was, I restore the beauty in families. Deep breath. Now imagine you're in an elevator and you happen to see the guy and say, what do you do? Go, I restore the beauty in families. Oh, how do you do that? Then you can explain. See, so beauty wouldn't be, an obvious one for a lot of people, and it might not be the right one for a lot of people, but it is for some people. It is for the people who, have what I call the beauty premise in life. So, anyway, so the process is, you might have a set of values already started with, that most people do if they're entrepreneurs, but now go back and examine them with a fresh set of eyes and literally just look at each of them and say, is this bullshit? Or have somebody who knows you look at them and say, are any of these inconsistent with the way that you know or understand my business or me? And then secondly, start to craft and say, if you could only have 3 of them, which would they be? In other words, maybe you got 10, but let's get rid of the ones that aren't absolutely positively essential. And then start to creatively say, now, if you were to reimagine your business, let's say we're going to burn it all down. Give me that sheet of paper. We're lighting a match to it. We're burning it all down. I want to start over now. Okay, we looked at those who got it. Now we're diving into flames. How can something more beautifully emerge like the phoenix out of these flames that we're going to build here? And start to have conversations around these values. What do you mean by integrity? Not integrity, but what do you mean by integrity? What do you mean by honesty? What do you mean by truth? What do you mean by whatever the value is? I wanted you to write a little bit of an essay around each one of those. And then you start to say, wow, the ones that you can write really eloquently to, those are probably the right ones. And the ones that you're struggling to try to write about, those probably aren't very good ones for you. So you go through this. When I used to do these weekends, we'd call them mountaintop masterminds, come in for an immersion. I'd work with these companies. What would happen is literally we did this work, which was the brand identity work, which is values, purpose, etc. And then we did a war room, and that was a whole SWOT analysis and all this other more practical stuff. But I had to do this first because I can't do the war room without knowing who you are.
Fundamentals,
first. Yeah. When I tell you, people want a plan of action, in their business, and I say, no, it has to start with a plan of being. I don't know what action you should take until you have to know who to be. That's the subtitle of my book: is how deciding who to be, not what to do, can transform your business. And that's what everybody misses. They want to know, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? It's not, the doing becomes very obvious once you understand the being. But if you don't understand the being, then you're chasing opportunity. You're not values based, and it goes off the rails. So, and we'd have to spend over half the time on this or more. And then the war room part got fast because we understood this stuff. So there's multiple ways to approach values, but what I could tell you is on the typical basis, most people who have a set of values that they're probably going to go away if you take this exercise seriously. And having values is the most important thing you can do for a business.
Amen. I want to drop in around there. There is a link to a training on YouTube that I coach people through their values as well. And like you said, because Amrit purpose coaching is pretty much what I do, and it is the first thing we go into as well. And Beautiful. It's just fundamental. And just to give you an idea, one of the things I think I'm hearing here is my values are connection, contribution, and celebration. And now it runs in everything I do. In this podcast, I've gotten to connect to you. I'm contributing hopefully to so many people, that everyone that's tuning in, right? You get a contribution from this. Hopefully it's helping you live a richer life, and hence celebration. You're able to celebrate life that little bit harder.
I love it.
But I also know
as you embody those. So you're dead on. You embody all 3 of those values clearly. So you're spot on. You found your Miles Davis.
Touch wood. It was a bit of a process, but yeah, like I said, there's a process, there's a training to that. I'll link that to the show notes for those that want to tune in for values as well. I love the values exercise. One of the things that you just mentioned in there that I want to again go deeper into is knowing that my values are connection, contribution, and celebration. When I first founded the Inspired Evolution, the values that I went for were health, purpose, and wisdom, right? Because I was like, when you're healthy, you're on purpose, and that was the kind of messaging behind it. And I realized actually that's the messaging behind it, absolutely. But if I get really real about it, and I've just been kind of coming home to this in the last 12 months, and I think this conversation is cementing it for me, is actually the values of the inspired evolution are connection, contribution, and celebration as well.
Thank you for making my point.
Thank you for giving me that level of clarity and permission to really, because I've been feeling that for a while, and I've literally just gone, I think that's really what's going to happen. I've been suggesting that, for more and more people, it's like create businesses in alignment to your own personal values. If you are the founder and the CEO, right? If you're an entrepreneur, find what parts of your values line up to the organization's values. And, it's not all of them will always click, but whatever ones do, they're your blessings in disguise. I think they're the ones that you can run with. So one of the questions I've got in there is also for those tuning in, it's like, okay, I've got my values, and potentially, there are opportunities where, we described this before, the moral versus the practical. And, the advice is to, hey, like, honor your values, please honor your values. In there, does that take some level of reimagination? Probably, we've heard about the phoenix and the fire, but there is some level of persistence required. Is there a call to persistence in there as well, Pat?
Yeah. It's interesting. I make a distinction. I teach a philosophy formula class. I have this group, and I come up with the philosophy of something every month. And one module was the philosophy of contradiction versus paradox. They're not the same thing, although they might look like the same thing sometimes. Because contradictions are literally things that self-negate, and they're important to identify, because if you do solve them, you evolve, and that's what paradoxes and contradictions have in common. Paradoxes are things that you integrate, because in other words, it seems like they seem contradictory, but if you can figure out how to bring them together, you evolve also. So it's another doorway to evolution. So what's interesting is that persistence to me is a little bit paradoxical, and I say that because I used to say, I used to always quote that thing, persistence and determination alone are omnipotent, right? And that way, you're persisting, and you have that endurance to persist. And now I have a premise, and the premise is persistence is a virtue until it isn't. And having taken businesses and driven them persistently for a period of time, a lot of times there's a persistence, and then there's a breakthrough, and wow, okay, we persisted and we got there. Then other times there's persistence, there's persistent, and there's bleeding, and there's all this havoc that's wreaked, and the consequence of which is that suddenly you end up in an exhaustive failure. So now, of course, what's about, how do you know when persistence is no longer a virtue? And that's called, nobody knows, but mastery in my mind is when you start to be able to identify those things.
The subtleties.
Yeah, it was just knowing when to do what. Like, for example, I guess what kind of goes maybe along with this is one of the things that I teach is the make-let paradox. And I say that sometimes in life you have to make things happen. Sometimes in life you have to let things happen. And the master of life knows when to do which. And that's the whole thing, saying, do I make this? Do I keep persisting here, or should I just kind of let this happen now? And when I was younger, I was all about making it happen no matter what. And that was the persistence and the drive, et cetera. I'm older now. I'm a little wiser now. I have different mantras and prayers in my life about how I want to live it. My number one core value for myself in my early life was significance. And that meant that I had to be working on significant things, like that had to be at extraordinary levels, and if I wasn't doing something significant to have massive impact and to change the world, I was never, so no matter how much I accomplished, I was never really feeling fulfilled, because there's always more significant things to do.
Mm.
That was hazardous for me in many respects.
Mm.
And as I went through transitions and maturations in my life, I replaced, and a lot of this was mindfulness practice, but I replaced significance with fulfillment. Now I just want to personally be fulfilled. I want to be able to look at that dew on a blade of grass after my meditation in the morning and cry because it's so beautiful, even if it's not significant. And the irony is that once I adopted, I changed that core value, and it shows how changing values can really impact things. I literally consciously adopted fulfillment as my number one core value from significance. My success grew so startlingly fast as far as reaching levels I never did before. That more significant things started to happen. So, it's very, very strange. So I guess, I'm saying this because I believe persistence is a necessary virtue. And I also believe that there's stages of life and career that require persistence in very significant ways. However, I do believe that as you evolve in your life, and you talk about inspired evolution, is the name of this thing, and that the whole concept of evolution is that when you've learned the lessons of persistence, I believe that persistence becomes less necessary.
I love that. The make-let paradox. It's like control and surrender. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that, man. I really appreciate that. One of the things that I will not let you go without talking about is you made a quick statement in your TED Talk about the fact that what makes us different to animals, like obviously there's a lot, but or potentially not that much. I don't know. We are animals at the end of the day. But one of the interesting things that makes us different is that we get to choose our purpose. And it was like, I had that moment where, like I felt like I was the 6 strings of a guitar and you went ring, and I was just like, So can you tell us a little bit about that, man? Like, I don't even have a question in there. I just want to revel in it. So
I love your question. That statement in that talk, I said, acknowledging that we are animals, but what makes us different than other forms of animal on the planet is the fact that we can choose a purpose. A dog cannot choose a purpose for its life. If it could, it probably would not be living with you.
I choose not to believe that. I heard you say that, and I was like,
I'm a dog lover, so
I'm pretty sure she loves me. But I great way to make a point. I got it.
And of course, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. A cow cannot choose a purpose for its life. If could, there be no such thing as McDonald's, right? So the idea is that what makes us unique as human beings is that we have this capacity for abstract conceptualization. We can think about our lives. We can think about our ancestors that came before us. We can think about a vision of the future that doesn't even exist right now, that we can play a role in creating. All this, what it boils down to is that we can choose a purpose. That's what makes us unique. However, the vast, vast majority of human beings have not chosen a purpose for their life. They live in survival mode. So, our many self-help gurus promulgate a philosophy of psychology or human motivation that is like very popular behaviorists in the turn of the 19th century into 20th century. And basically their premise was that mankind lives in the seeking of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So this is the so-called pain pleasure principle. So they basically tried to describe human nature in the context of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And when they give examples like, you would do this because you wanted to avoid pain. You did this because you were seeking pleasure, so that your life is almost, you're this automaton that is seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and that's the motive forces of your life. And then that got translated into the self-development, success oriented movement, and people would get up, and talk and promulgate pain pleasure principle. And I heard it, and there was a logic to it. But intuitively, I said, there's something dehumanizing about that as a premise. And I went to work thinking about it. And then I realized, well, wait a minute, where does purpose fit into that? Because if you have a compass setting that says I'm moving in this direction, call it your true north, and I'm going in that direction, in that journey, I'm going to experience pain, but I'm going to continue. If I have a purpose, I'm still going through the pain because I want to go in that direction. And then as I'm continuing, there's going to be pleasure along the way too. Pain and pleasure will always come on an alternating basis in everybody's life. So the only constant companion in my mind should be purpose. Purpose is always there. Sometimes there's pain, sometimes there's pleasure, but your constant companion is purpose. So I believe that in order to have a fully human experience, you have to be purpose driven. You have to have a constant sense of purpose in your life, know that purpose and move in the direction of that purpose. And that's what will prevent you from chasing blinky, shiny things and going off track and avoiding pain and seeking pleasure. Animals, a dog lives pain, pleasure. Any animal lives pain, pleasure. They're seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. They're living in what's called survival mode. And the majority of human beings are also living in survival mode. And my conclusion on it is that if you're not purpose driven, you're living a subhuman experience. You're not actually having the human experience. You're having an experience that's relegated to other species of animals.
Okay, so as the purpose coach, I'm going to take that extract and make that the trailer to everything that I do.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because ultimately, what I'm hearing in there also is, and this has been true from my own experience in life and where the whole journey around purpose came from for me was, the fact that the pleasure that comes from being on your purpose, you talked about fulfillment, it's very different to a happiness. It's this nourishing inner kind of joy that you get, and it's not easy, right? In the normal sense of the word, but there's a joy in there. And one of the most amazing things I personally find as well is there are so many challenges when you're walking out on your purpose, and you can associate that to pain, but you find yourself rolling up your sleeves and going, let's get in there. Let's have a look at that and let's really work on it. And it's like, wow, I'm really going into my pain, or I'm really, and it's like, my purpose is driving me there. And it's like, wow, the grace with which I get to navigate this, thanks to purpose, is just, I dedicated my life to it, basically. Talking about dedicating your life, brother, what is your purpose?
To enliven humanity.
I love that. I love that. Man, Pat, there is so much more that I would love to talk to you about. I want to honor the time and the podcast here today. I want to give you my deepest heartfelt thanks for your time and energy for being here, man. And also, I know it's not just today that we get to talk about all of this. It's a lifetime's work that you've put into yourself, into this conversation, the way you're showing up in the world, the books you've written, the films you've made, the work you've done on others. Brother, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. And even though we're virtual, you have such an extraordinary expressive ability that I feel like I'm in the room with you right now. It's amazing.
Touch wood. Thank you. Thank you to those tuning in, Inspired Evolution Tribe community. Love you guys so much. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I know you got so much out of it. As always, whatever's ripe and pressing for you, leave us a comment below. That's me directing literally myself talking back to you in the comment section below. And on behalf of myself and the Inspired Evolution Tribe, everybody tuning in, Pat, wishing you all the best on your journey, brother.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave us a comment. And if you want to stay in tune for new episodes launching every Monday, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired to evolve.